Hello, my name's Scott Brackett. I'm a musician and synth nerd, and probably just regular nerd too. I would like to welcome you to the Retro Synth video program, part 2, where I'm going to be talking about the C1 and CX5m music computers. Yamaha synthesizers have sent me these machines and are sponsoring this video, so thank you for watching. Let's get started.
Retro Synth video program.
So in my last video, I briefly introduced the CX5m Mark I and Mark II, and today I'll show you what it's like to actually use them. Well, today I'll show you what it's like to use the Mark II anyways. In order to use the Mark I, I'll need to make a cable to connect it to a modern TV or computer monitor, and I'll hopefully get to that in part 3. The Mark II, on the other hand, already has an RCA output, so connecting it to a composite input on a monitor requires no modifications. Once you connect the CX5m to a monitor and connect it to power, you can turn it on and it will boot into a version of the BASIC programming environment. BASIC stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Instruction Code. And on the CX5m, you can either use it to run programs from internal memory or cartridges connected to the computer, or you can actually write your own computer programs and run them. Here's an example program that I copied from the instruction manual. Getting the syntax right can be a little tricky since you have to write the entire thing out without any kind of auto-completion or code highlighting or anything, but it's still pretty novel. And to be able to convert the back page of a manual into something that this computer can turn into generative graphics is pretty cool. That said, when you have a syntax error, it takes a while to hunt it down. Now, if I had a memory cartridge, I'd be able to save this program, but for now, I'll have to let it go because I don't have the cartridge that you can plug in and allow you to have persistent storage on this device. So that was fun, but you might be asking yourself, okay, it makes shapes. Great. I thought this thing was supposed to be an instrument. What's it sound like? Well, let me use the keyboard I've connected and start making some sounds with it. So here's the sound editing program, and basically you can open up sounds and change various aspects of the patches and make your own presets with this software. The CX5m Mark I and II are both 8-voice, 4-operator FM synthesizers, and they have a very distinctive sound. But if I'm being honest, most of my experience sounded a little more like this. Bad command. Yeah, a lot of manual page turning and humming. Mostly, I have to be honest, this whole experience with the CX5m made me really appreciate the modern interfaces for programming FM synthesis. This is something I already knew, that the Rephase DX and the Mode DX were, vastly improved over previous generations of FM synthesis. But yeah, aside from not being able to find out where to turn off the little beep from the CX5m, every single thing was just so much more difficult to try to turn an idea into an actual patch. I did eventually settle into a rhythm, but I wouldn't call it intuitive by any stretch. And since I don't have the memory cartridge, I can't save any of these patches, so really wasn't a whole lot of light at the end of the tunnel for me. FM was not a desirable type of synthesis when I first started getting into synthesizers in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's easy to see why when sort of the interfaces for programming them were so inaccessible to most people. That was partially what led me to them, not just because I was a budding hipster, but also they were super cheap. You could find a PSS 170 or 480 for less than $10 at the thrift stores, and then you could circuit bend them and all kinds of fun stuff. At the time, people were either fully in the analog synth-only camp or convinced that software plugins would replace all synthesizers in just a few years. Now, if you're familiar with my work at all, you know that I don't pick sides in the digital versus analog wars, and that I think every piece of gear has something that it is perfectly suited for. So that's the spirit in which I say that I really enjoy the way the CX5m sounds. I don't have the full accompaniment software, but loaded into the ROM of this machine is a basic accompaniment software you can call up by typing in the command call music. This software is where I've spent the most time because it's where this device really becomes an instrument. It has a multi-page interface where you can choose your sounds, configure which MIDI channels they respond to, and record passages of MIDI songs. You can also save and recall some of that information. As I dug through articles and forums trying to find out information on this synth, I saw several people write that they mostly use the CX5m by playing it live and recording onto a tape machine, but that this software made a pretty nice interface for the synth. Using the software myself, I definitely came to the same kind of conclusion. I'm a little spoiled with the features that come with more modern sequencers, and so the idea of composing songs of any complexity in this environment on its own seems pretty daunting. The sounds, however, are deliciously old school FM. Obviously, the delicious part is a subjective thing, but much of my musical influences are from video game soundtracks, and early FM synthesis was a huge part of early DOS-era gaming. The sound chip in this synthesizer is not identical, but very similar to the multi-timbral sound chip that was in a lot of sound cards of the day. So there's definitely a nostalgia factor, and there's a particular lo-fi character that I find very charming and inspiring to work with. Maybe not my desert island synth, but certainly a cool texture to sprinkle into a composition, or the perfect tool to recreate that DOS-era soundtrack feeling. So that's the CX5m in a nutshell. It's an odd little duck, probably only a piece for collectors, but if you also happen to be a retro gaming enthusiast, you could pick up one of these and also be able to play MSX cartridge games on it, and compose your next synthwave masterpiece on the same machine. So next up we have the Yamaha C1 music computer, which is a really interesting machine in my opinion. It's basically just an IBM PC 286 computer with 8 built-in MIDI ports and an integrated monochrome screen. Why would you want 8 MIDI ports? Why not just use a MIDI splitter? Well, for one thing, it's one more thing to carry and set up, but more importantly, you can specify which MIDI port you want to send commands to from your software. So that gives you the ability to send all 16 MIDI channels to a single device instead of having to choose which device is getting which channel. One possibility is using the various ports to control multi-timbral synths. If you were controlling multiple multi-timbral devices through a single MIDI port, you'd have to sacrifice some channels to make that work. Say, dedicate channels 1 through 6 to your QY100, and then channels 7 through 10 for your motif, and channels 11 through 16 for your MoDX. But by telling your software which port you'd like a particular track or group of tracks to send to, you can address all 16 channels to each instrument using the dedicated ports. Okay, so it's got a ton of ports, great. But what's it like to actually make music with it? I'm so glad you asked. Going from luggable black box to record-ready studio session is not so different from the modern DAW experience. You turn it on, you wait for it to boot up. When the operating system loads, you start your software of choice. Voila. However, instead of loading software from a hard drive, you load it from a floppy disk. And instead of your MIDI drivers loading automatically, you have to use a command to install them into memory before each session. And of course, instead of clicking on a shortcut on your desktop or taskbar, you insert the appropriate floppy disk and enter the text command to launch the software. Now, the driver stuff might sound like a pain, but not having 30 device drivers loaded invisibly in the background when you start your computer up means you won't have super frustrating driver conflicts. You know, where you've installed a device for a USB capture card 3 years ago and forgot about it, and now every time you try to adjust your MIDI settings in your DAW, it crashes. And no one on the message boards is having the same problem, so you can't find any helpful threads. You know, that whole thing. So while running the command to install drivers every time you start your computer might seem like a waste of time, this kind of intentionality offers a bit of insurance by putting in a little time up front for each session. Plus, it integrates a nice arm toning exercise into your daily computing. So as usual, it kind of boils down to what flavor of tedium you prefer. Once you got your drivers installed and your software of choice started, it's time to get working. One of my personal favorites was a program called Texture by Magnetic Music. This is still available for download at their website, and I reached out to the programmer Slim to thank him and make sure it was okay to use the software, even though I never owned an original copy, and he was incredibly helpful. So once the machine boots up, we're going to install our MIDI drivers. And in this case, it's going to be the CAPI driver, CAPI. And once that loads, which I didn't cut any time out of, that's how long the driver takes to install. So pretty quick. And then TXCR to launch the actual application. And I won't cut any time out of this one either, so you can get a sense of how long it takes to open the program, which really isn't that bad. I think it's maybe 15 seconds. But if you compare that to opening a modern DAW or something like that, it's pretty comparable if you're running a fast machine. And so now we're ready to go. I've got the Reface DX set up. And basically, as you can see, there are patterns, and within each pattern I've got kind of tracks, A1, B1, C1, that kind of thing. And I can write MIDI information into each track, either sending it to the same channel or to a different channel, and then I can put each of those in their own patterns. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see there's note off, note on, control, program, aftertouch. So it's pretty thorough MIDI implementation, and it's a very satisfying system to work in. And once you get familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, it's actually really, really fast. The biggest drawback was using the Metronome, which I'll show you here in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and start a new file. I'll hit F and N, and then Y to confirm. All right, and once we have a new file loaded up, get my headphones on here. We can move through by hitting plus and minus to do the different patterns. I think there's 96 patterns per song, yeah. And within each pattern, I can change how long it is, and I can record multiple different phrases into each track. So let me go ahead and do F1. I'm going to set the dimension, which is the length of the loop. Let's say change the dimension from 1 to 5, and we'll do a really quick one. Okay, arm it and record. 1, 2, 3. And let's hear that. Okay. Now let's go to another track and we'll hit R and arm it. 2, 3, 4. All right, let's hear that. Okay. And we'll do maybe a bass part. Probably going to be pretty complicated. All right, let's go. And arm it. 2. Let's hear that. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to build up stuff. If I recorded something I didn't like, okay, so say I didn't care for that. Fortunately, I had quantize on, so when I push play, it's actually not terrible. But let's say I hated that. I would hit U to undo and then Y to confirm, and now it's gone. So, you know, it's interesting. I really enjoy being able to work exclusively with the keyboard only, and everything is pretty quick. Like even the confirms don't require that I hit Y for yes and enter. It's just you hit one, you strike one key, and the next thing happens. So it ends up being pretty quick. So anyways, that's what it's like to use the C1. And real quick before we wrap up, I wanted to show the MoDX with the C1. Since the MoDX is a multi-timbral synthesizer, you can actually address the individual voices with the C1. And I had a ton of fun playing with that. So as you can see, unlike the CX5m, where I felt like the composition features just weren't there, the C1 actually has really full-featured MIDI composition. But that makes sense because it doesn't make any sound on its own. For me, the C1 really occupies a sweet spot where it grants you a lot of the compositional amenities that are very helpful, while not taking on some of the distractions and complexity of more modern computer systems. Join us next time when I'll talk more about my attempts to bring these machines into the modern age and compare their workflow to Yamaha's latest device with a hardware sequencer on it, the Modi X. So thanks again to Yamaha for giving me this project, and thank you for continuing to watch. I look forward to getting into part 3, and if you have any questions or comments, please put them below or wherever the comment box is on the platform you're watching this. And if you like and want to subscribe, hit the appropriate buttons to do that, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.